If this story finds a place with you, please subscribe and stay with me through Callan's quiet choosing. There's more ahead worth waiting for. The barn smelled of old hay and machinery oil, of cold breath and metal. Sunlight cut through the raised seams in the corrugated roof in pale, tired bars. Callan Brooks stood with his jacket bunched in his fist, and the small tremor he'd been keeping under his ribs since Rowan's last seizure folded into something else, a fierce, simple refusal. Around them the crowd moved in the half-light, voices flat, catalogued like the items stacked along the rafters: engines, furniture, a pile of winter coats. Children huddled by the rafters, thin as folded paper because they were meant to be unseen. He had not planned to be here. He had gone because the county had sent him a notice, because some social worker had said, in an authoritative voice that nevertheless crumbled at the edges, "They'll be at the sale." Callan had driven the old pickup with the heater on low, Rowan asleep between them, a knitted blanket over his knees, and the tapping language they'd built together, 3 quick taps for home, 2 for more, memorized in Callan's palm like prayer. Rowan's fingers were soft and calloused, small moons of skin where he'd learned to read the world by touch. Callan watched those fingers now, wanted to protect them as he would a flame. The auctioneer spoke in practiced rhythms, making the hush and the offers, and a woman stood near a stack of crates with 2 children at her feet, Aurelia and Lyra, twins, one folded inward like a bird bracing for wind, the other already poised to speak to whichever ear happened to listen. Callan could see the shop-worn line of their shoulders, the bruises hidden under layers, the way Lyra's fingers found Aurelia's wrist like a lifeline. They were small, too small for the weight on them. He felt the bidding like a physical thing in his throat. People argued for old furniture, for a tractor, for a quiet sofa that would be stripped for parts later. The little children were held in the background like an ugly misunderstanding. Callan's throat closed when he heard the sum someone offered for 2 children, said with that casual cruelty, as though the phrase belonged with the chairs. He did not know the law in such a moment, only the beating in his chest and the code he and Rowan had stitched together: home, more, stay, words that had grafted themselves onto his hands. Callan raised his hand once, then again. His voice was a dry thing when the auctioneer called his name as a bid. The crowd hiccuped between curiosity and amusement. He was a single father, known in town for fixing fences and making bread for the food pantry when he had a little left. He was not a man of money. But he had something to offer that the ledger in front of the auctioneer did not measure: stability, a roof that did not fit the tally sheet, and an old desperation that made him act. When the gavel came down, the world narrowed to the small, incredulous faces of the twins, and Rowan awake now, his hand moving in the code, 3 taps from the blanket, and Callan understood what he could not understand. He paid what he could. It was not much. It was not enough in the ledger sense. It was everything in the other. Driving home with 3 children folded into the truck, Callan watched Lyra's face in the rear view as twilight rubbed the world toward blue. She pressed her forehead against the window and played with the condensation, a small spiraled map of Russia and oceans and a future she would name herself. Aurelia kept her hands in her lap, fingers laced like a prayer, watching Rowan watch the world with his hands. Palms searching the hems of coats, tracing the seams of a worn seat, finding the radiator grating and listening to its tiny metallic music. The little house on Maple Street was small and crooked, a place of patchwork heat and a stove that warmed the rooms in reluctant waves. Callan's life had been measured by what could fit on the table, by how many jars of tomato sauce he could can and stack for the leaner months. Yet the idea of letting them go, the image of their smallness being crushed by indifference, made something in him lock like a pressed spring. The first night was taut with a kind of brittle hope. Rowan smelled of heat and soap and hay. He adapted by touch. He tapped out a code against Callan's palm after the children were settled. 3, 2, home, more. Callan rested his thumb against the boy's knuckles, a promise folded into skin. The twins shared a cot pushed against the wall. Lyra whispered stories under the blanket, breath quick like a sparrow's, while Aurelia listened with the slow attention of someone cataloging a wound, how it ached, and how it could be soothed. There were 100 small practicalities: the misbuttoned shirts, the broken shoelaces, a bottle for Rowan's medicine that rattled gently like a metronome of responsibility. Callan moved through them with a quiet economy. Steam from the kettle on the stove, eggs cracked into a pan that made a thin, steady hiss. He laid out clean towels he'd stolen from his supply closet at work, warmed some soup that had survived the drive like a secret. When Lyra reached for the salt, Callan showed her how to pinch. Just a little, he told her, and she nodded as though learning a new law. Aurelia's hands were precise in the way that small hands often are when the person has had to earn the right to touch. She tended to Rowan with a patient, almost clinical curiosity, watching his finger find the embedded knot in the wood of the bedside table, and marking how his face unfurled when his thumb found texture. She learned his rhythm and began to speak softly into it, coaxing vowels like tiny tools. R, O, An, and waiting for the long, patient blink that meant he had understood. Rowan, who had been braced against sound and light for most of his life, answered with a new, small sound that was nothing more than a breath and nearly everything. Callan watched Aurelia's jaw relax in that slow, almost imperceptible way of a person allowing joy to touch them. Days settled into the shape of a family by degrees. They ate at the same worn table, hands finding each other's like anchors. Lyra was a wind in the house, scattering laughter and small rebellions, stealing cookies, daring Rowan to stand on a chair, singing loudly in the shower while Aurelia scolded. She made errands into adventures. She charmed Miss Louise at the library before Callan could even open his mouth to apologize. Miss Louise, a woman with a perpetual cardigan and a voice like dry leaves, watched Aurelia with a librarian's instinct for deep, private treasure. She invited the twins to a weekly reading hour and, in the small molasses of community time, gave them a place where words could be trusted. The tapping system with Rowan grew into something tender and ingenious. He learned to count syllables by touch, to find the offset of a word by the bump of a knuckle. Callan taught him the pattern for soup, for footing, for garden. Aurelia, who had been like a wound then a healer, invented little games where Rowan's hand would find a cold spoon or a warm cup, and each discovery was a small victory. On the porch, against the mattress of falling snow, the children held hands and let their breath fog the night air. A porch light burned because Callan always left one on. It became, in the twins' language, the promise light. Lyra insisted on naming it. Lantern, she declared, and they all took to calling it that. Callan lit a candle inside the kitchen window and watched the small flicker cut into the dark. Light, literal and otherwise, worked its slow miracles. The town reacted in the way small towns do, with a mixture of suspicion, curiosity, and, eventually, warmth. A few neighbors whispered about the cost Callan had paid, about his ability to care for 2 children besides his son. The principal at the little school frowned over paperwork, and then softened when Lyra marched into her office and declared, in no uncertain terms, that she would not tolerate children being left outside in the wind. Lyra could get what she wanted in public with the bluntness of someone for whom polite request had once been deadly. Aurelia learned to speak in public in a different way, quiet, measured, with facts folded into statements so they could not be dismissed. There were, along the way, moments that pried at Callan's composure. Once, in a sudden storm that blew like a hand across the town, the electricity winked out and the house went dark. The children slept fitfully, their dreams startled by thunder that came without reason. Colin fetched oil lamps and the old kerosene lantern from the shed, and in the circle of their light he read from a battered book Miss Louise had lent, a book of poems about hands and earth. He read the words aloud, because voices have a power to stitch fear back together. Rowan, who did not always show it, pressed his palm to Callan's cheek and tapped 3, 2. Callan understood, not with his mind first, but in his bones. He whispered, "Home," and felt the word fall like a settling hand. Little anonymous things arrived like miracles. An envelope slipped through the mailbox with a crisp certificate for Rowan's hearing evaluation. A second envelope contained a modest, used stethoscope, its metal cold and precise, tucked into a letter that said, simply, "A friend believes in you." Callan found a knitted scarf on the porch, thick and smelling faintly of lavender, and a pair of children's boots left at the back of the pantry as if the town had suddenly decided to supply their steps. Those gestures were never announced. They came as if the town itself had taken a breath and, in that moment, chosen to be kinder. On a sun-muffled afternoon, Callan took the children to the library where Miss Louise presided over a kingdom of soft chairs and warm light. Rows of books became a new geography for Aurelia, who catalogued illnesses and herbs and small leather-bound manuals like someone mapping a possible future. She would sit with Rowan on a poof and let her fingers run through a book's gutters, describing the paper to him with the quiet precision of a healer listing instruments. Lyra devoured biographies of women who had built things from nothing. Callan watched them learn to trust places in addition to people. It was Miss Louise who first mentioned Vivian Hartley. The name floated into conversation like a coin dropped and left to catch light. "Second Light," Miss Louise said, turning a page with a corner of a finger, "has been helping families for years, quietly. A woman named Vivian has done small things without drawing attention." The description was sparse, as Miss Louise preferred the world. No embellishment, no unnecessary noise. Callan tucked the name into his pocket mentally, along with the names of the anonymous gloves and the scarf, and continued to move through the days. Aurelia began to act like a small hospital in the house. She learned how to wash a wound without flinching, to bind a sprained ankle with the patience of someone practicing rhythm. Callan remembered the first time she cleaned a scab on Rowan's palm, the way she held his hand, how she spoke to him like a practiced midwife of small things. "Breathe, watch the light." Rowan watched her in a way that suggested recognition, as if he had found a map and he learned to touch again. Her hands, calloused at the edges, came to mean more than medicine. They became an invitation. Colin began to teach her how to mix the right amount of flour into a bread dough, showed her how to feel when the loaf had been kneaded enough by pressing it like a small animal. Warm bread, baked in the small oven, became a ritual, cut with care, shared while the steam fogged their faces. It was domestic, unflashy, and miraculous in its steadiness. There were days when the old system of letters and envelopes worked in stranger ways. One morning, after a week of weather that pressed the town flat and white, Callan found an envelope on his doorstep containing a check, enough to fix the leaky roof that had been whispering its threat during every hard rain. There was no signature, only the words "Second Light" and a small hand-drawn lamp. Callan sat on the steps with the envelope on his knee and thought of the light he left burning in the kitchen window. He thought of the way someone had chosen to keep them safe without announcing themselves. He wanted to find the giver and say thank you, but the giver seemed to have chosen a different liturgy, help without ceremony. When Vivian Hartley finally came into their lives, it was at the library on a Wednesday afternoon, where she moved with a discretion that belonged to people with means but not to spectacle. She wore a coat the color of drained rainwater and carried a leather satchel that had clearly been polished for a lifetime. Her hair was hidden under a simple cap, and when she spoke as if she had been practicing listening her whole life. Miss Louise introduced her like a bookmark slipped into a sentence. "Vivian knows about funding for regional foster programs," she said, and then left them to work out the rest. Vivian was not what Callan had pictured. She was neither theatrical nor distant. When she crouched down to meet the twins' eyes, she let her voice be small enough to be trusted. She did not speak of absolution or grand rescues. Instead, she moved through their house with the practiced eye of someone who had once been small and had also learned how to survive by observing where light pooled and where shadows fell. She noticed the worn spot on the kitchen chair where Rowan's toes drummed while waiting for breakfast. She asked, casually, if she might leave a little fund to help with school supplies. Callan said no at first, because pride hummed under his ribs. Vivian quoted him a small smile and said, "Pride is a fine thing to keep if it does not eat the bread." She was the founder of a small charity called Second Light, she explained later in a quiet conversation over tea in Miss Louise's reading alcove. She had been orphaned as a child and had been given help by strangers who did not make a show of it. She believed in modest generosity. Lamps left on, boots mended, evaluations paid for, things that were not a spectacle, but a scaffolding. She offered to help with Rowan's hearings and to sponsor Aurelia for an assistant training program at the community college. She said, with a calmness Callan could not match, that she only wanted to ensure stability, that she would not be the hand that took everything away. Callan received the help as if someone had placed cool water on a fevered brow. There was a hard learning curve in accepting assistance. He worried about strings, about the labor of gratitude becoming debt. Vivian met that with an economy of speech. "There are no strings," she told him once, "only a light to be kept. You can keep it on for as long as you need." The exchange was small and perfect. It set a tone. The family would accept help, but the help would not be a tidal wave. It would be a lamp on their porch. The town's recognition did not arrive all at once. It came as a slow accretion. Someone offering to trim the hedges, a neighbor fixing a broken step, the school awarding Lyra a small certificate for courage and community spirit because she had organized a winter clothing drive and dragged half the kids in her class into collecting hats and mittens. The certificate made Lyra beam in a way that could have broken glass. She stood on a small riser at the school assembly and read a short, blunt statement about what it meant to be left and then found. "When you're left," she said into the microphone, "you find people." It was not polished, it was not finished, it was, in its bluntness, true. At the county hall, the legal tangle of guardianship took shape like a formal clockwork. There were forms and an interview, and the odd bureaucratic ritual of proving you had enough heat and a bed for a child. Callan, who had been unaccustomed to asking permission for living, stood in a small windowed room with a folder of documents and felt tested by the quiet of official speech. He had to show his bank account and a list of references. Miss Louise wrote one, the principal wrote another, and finally the county clerk looked at him and then at the children and said simply, "You understand responsibility." Callan answered with the weight of a man who had always known it. He did not speak much of faith in those rooms. He spoke with the steadiness of someone who had been shaped by 1,000 small, sacrificial acts. When the legal papers were signed months later, the sense of relief that swept through the house was not dramatic. It fell like light through curtains. Lyra danced on the kitchen floor, while Aurelia quietly folded a stack of new school shirts. Rowan tapped 3, 2 on Callan's hand and then rested his head on his father's shoulder. Callan watched them and felt something like a song rising in him, made of small thanks and the knowledge that they had, together, built a house that would hold them. There were awards and public acknowledgments, modest plaques given by the community center for outstanding family resilience. But the most important recognitions were quieter. An invitation to teach a small class at the library on how to make preserves. A neighbor leaving a packet of seeds on their porch with a note, "Plant when ready." The garden became the project that tied them forward. Aurelia read about soil and nutrient cycles and recommended an early bed of radishes and marigolds for their first season. Lyra announced she would plant a sunflower taller than the roofline. Callan dug with his hands until the cold gave and the soil surrendered to the rhythm of planting. In the kitchen one morning, after the first tentative sprouts pushed through the warmed earth of their little plot, Callan made pancakes, a small celebration for the green. He stood at the stove with a worn spatula, listening to the batter hiss and bubble. Rowan's fingers tapped a little drum on the table, the code now part of the house's breath. Lyra topped her stack with maple syrup and insisted, by the logic only a 10-year-old can marshal, that pancakes should be eaten with stories. Aurelia, who had learned to measure both sugar and tenderness, arranged the plates like a small surgeon. Callan watched them and felt the years of worry unspool a bit. He thought of the barn, of the cold auction voice, and trembled at how far they had come. Even with the steady warmth, the shadows held lessons. There were nights when Callan lay awake listening for the moth of grief to come and whisper what might have been. He would walk the house, checking the doors, making sure the porch light was on. And sometimes, in a quiet corner, he would say a one-sentence prayer that was more like a vow: keep them safe. He said it with the bluntness of a man who had learned to measure faith in small acts: locking a door, fixing a roof, listening. Then there were the letters, small notes the children wrote and left for themselves and for the future. Aurelia folded a thin piece of paper and tucked it into a mason jar labeled, "For when I am scared." Inside, she wrote in precise handwriting reminders: breathe, count to 5, touch the table and name 3 things. Lyra wrote a boisterous letter to her future self, promising she would never stop speaking up for anyone left outside. Rowan, with Aurelia's help, learned to press shapes into clay, on which Aurelia carved his name so he could feel it later. These acts of writing were a way of building continuity, a ribbon from the present to a possible tomorrow. And sometimes, in that small, ordinary way, miracles kept arriving. A teacher who took the twins under her wing. A donated pair of glasses for Rowan that improved the way light broke across his face. A winter coat with a lined hood big enough to make Lyra laugh at the novelty of warmth. Vivian's presence continued as an unassuming constancy. An occasional check-in, a quiet payment for a class here and there, a note on the porch with a suggestion for a surgeon who could make a small corrective procedure for Rowan that had been impossible otherwise. She never demanded their story be shaped into gratitude. She expected only that they live and give when they could. On an afternoon that tasted of late autumn and the deepening of ordinary things, Lyra was invited to stand before the town at a small ceremony honoring community volunteers. She walked up to the microphone, knees brushing her coat, and said, with a steadiness that made several people blink, "Sometimes people think being small means you don't matter, but small things bind us." The applause was not thunderous. It was the sort of sustained clapping you give when you are moved and the movement is honest. Callan watched Lyra from the 3rd row, Rowan tucked in on his lap with his head against Callan's shoulder, and felt, for the first time, the town's attention making a space rather than shining a spotlight. The legal finalization of guardianship came not as a spectacle, but as the quiet end of a bureaucratic endurance. Callan signed the papers with a pen that rattled slightly in his hand because he was tired and because the act carried weight. The clerk stamped the document, an ordinary, officious sound, and the children clapped because anything that involves paper and a stamp was reason enough to celebrate. Outside the county building, it snowed in the soft way snow does in small towns, not the dramatic plunge, but the steady accumulation that makes sidewalks soft. They walked home together with the feeling that their place in the world had been acknowledged. The end of that winter brought small futures into view. Aurelia enrolled in the assistant program and began to take night classes, returning home with textbooks that smelled like paper and possibility. Lyra joined a youth council at school and organized drives with an all-consuming zeal. Rowan, who had been quietly blossoming, began to babble new sounds and experiment with a few new words that were more than the code. The garden promised a new season. Callan, who had once measured his days by how much firewood he had stacked, began to imagine rain barrels and a better roof, a future he did not have to hold alone. There were, of course, unresolved things, memories that seeped back like the smell of smoke through a closed window, but they sought alongside the small rituals of care: bread that rose as it should, a porch light left on, a jar with seeds labeled Future. Callan kept a box of letters in the top of his wardrobe. In it, he collected notes from neighbors, Miss Louise's clipped recommendations, and a folded card from Vivian that read, simply and without flourish, "Keep the light." He kept the card because it reminded him how close the world could come to being kind when people chose to show up. On a bright morning that smelled like rain and new work, Colin carried a small tray of pancakes out to the porch and set them on the step. Lyra planted sunflowers with her small shovel. Aurelia arranged small ceramic tags on seedling rows, and Rowan traced the letters on a jar with his fingers until he could feel the shape that read, "Home." Colin sat at the table in a way he had not allowed himself for a long time, rested in the presence of the life he had not known he was capable of making. He pressed his hand to Rowan's and felt the small tapping, 3, 2. In the kitchen, the light from the window caught the dust in a steady, humble beam, and for once it did not seem to be asking anything of them other than to be noticed. Colin had become a hero in the way heroes often are, unadorned, made of the decisions to stay and to act again and again. He had not saved the world, he had saved 2 small lives and the small domestic orbit that held them all. It was enough to change the shape of days. If you've been moved by Colin's quiet choosing, tell us where you're watching from in the comments. Subscribe for more stories like this, and consider a small act of kindness where you are. Donate to a local food pantry, volunteer at your library, or simply check on a neighbor. Small lights make a town. Spring folded itself into the town like a careful hand smoothing a quilt. Days lengthened with a slant of gold. The air carried the green smell of garden earth turned over, and the faint tang of paint left on porch rails. Colin woke earlier than he had in years, not because duty nagged at him, but because there were things he wanted to see happen before the afternoon blurred into routine. He made coffee, thick and steady, and watched Rowan practice walking along the kitchen floor, tiny fists braced on the back of a wooden chair. Each time Rowan let go for a breath, Colin felt the faint, fierce lift of hope, like the first time you nail a board and it holds. Lyra's energy had the precise urgency of someone learning how much could be moved with a small, steady shove. The Youth Council had given her official permission to run a weekend reading program at the library, and she treated the stacks like a new landscape to explore. She painted signs with block letters and paw prints, wrote a schedule that looked impossibly neat on a single sheet, and recruited kids who came for the promise of cookies and stayed because she knew how to make them feel seen. On the first Saturday, she sat cross-legged on the carpet and read aloud until her voice softened from concentration into laughter. Rowan toddled in when Lyra's voice made a rising cadence, and for a moment the room thinned to the sound of page-turning and small feet. Aurelia balanced her textbooks on the passenger seat of her old car and read through chapters at traffic lights, at bus stops, with a pen tucked behind her ear. Night classes meant she often came home with the moon still in the sky, and there were evenings she sat at the kitchen table with her notebook open and Callan's slow humming filling the room while Rowan slept. The children learned to anticipate Aurelia's frustrated sighs and to pass a glass of water without being asked. There were papers marked with red ink, there were scores that did not match the effort she felt inside. But there were also small victories. A tutor who stayed an extra hour in the library to help her understand a passage, a classmate who sent a message saying, "You'll get there, keep the drafts." Those messages she saved in the same box where Callan kept his letters, a small archive of encouragement. The town, in its habitual generosity, turned its attention outward as much as inward. A proposal floated in the spring papers. Cuts at the community center that would shorten hours for the senior lunch program and trim the modest stipend for art classes that drew children like moths to a porch light. The idea of losing that anchor made people in the town move with a little more intentionality. Lyra decided their reading program would be part of a benefit. Stories and soup and a silent auction of knitted scarves and pottery. She put together a team that included Miss Louise, who wrote notes and collected jars of pickles, Jonas from the lumberyard, who offered to build a sign, and Vivian, who folded flyers with a steadiness that had made her a friend to both Callan and the children. Callan offered the garden as a point of production. It turned out that what a garden could give was not just tomatoes and basil, but a place to organize, to talk, to stand shoulder to shoulder with people you had always known. Neighbors dug and weeded. Callan showed a boy how to tamp soil around a seedling and found himself explaining, without thinking, how the small pressure kept the plant upright against wind. The boy listened as if this were the most sensible thing anyone had said to him all week. Aurelia brought jars of extra jam and signs she'd painted, and Lyra insisted that Rowan be the garden mascot, a role he fulfilled by pulling up a handful of earth and grinning as if he had unearthed treasure. There were harder mornings. Sometimes memories surfaced like bad weather, details that smelled of smoke or the flash of a frightened animal, quick and bright and then gone. Callan learned to name them to himself and let them pass, like clouds crossing the sun. Once, returning from the lumberyard, he stopped at the base of the hill where the house used to stand before the fire and looked up at the quiet slope. Nothing remained but a flat, tidy swath of grass and the occasional stone. Still, his chest tightened for a raw second. He laid a hand on Rowan's head and felt the child's warm, ordinary weight, and that touch folded the ache into something bearable. He had become practiced at small reckonings, enough to go forward without pretending the past had not happened. The benefit night arrived with the clean nervousness of a small-town play. Strings of lights hung from the front of the community center, their bulbs soft as teeth in the dark. A line of folding tables carried soup ladles and stacks of bowls. The library donated chairs. Jonas supplied wood pallets for a stage, and Miss Louise's pickles were the sort of comfort that made people sit a while longer. Lyra worked the microphone like someone who'd been born to it. She introduced readers, kept time with a clipboard, and when it was her turn to speak, she told an old folktale she had reworked into something that made the children shriek with delight. Children painted paper lanterns while adults bid on knitted throws in the silent auction. Aurelia manned the bake sale table with a steady hand, her palms flour-dusted, and people bought not because the prices were high, but because buying felt like voting. There was a moment late in the evening when the organizers realized they had raised enough funds not only to keep the senior lunch program running for another year, but also to sponsor 2 more weeks of art classes for the children. The applause was longer than it needed to be, the sort that lets people know they had been part of something healthier than they'd expected. Callan had not planned to speak, but someone asked, as people often do at gatherings like this, if he would say a brief word. He stood with his fingers curled around the edge of the stage palette. The light caught the lines at his eyes and the small bruises of tiredness that live under the skin of those who have given everything without fanfare. He told a story that was not about himself exactly, but about how hands matter. The hands that bring soup, the hands that seed soil, the hands that turn a page. He did not make a speech that would be written up in the town newsletter. He said what he felt. Gratitude and a reminder that the job of keeping a place good was not heroic so much as a habit. A woman in the front row began to clap, and others followed, until the sound filled the small room like a wind that lifts papers and brings them to life. After the applause, Rowan, who had been asleep against Aurelia's shoulder, woke and, for some reason only a child understands, began to clap too. He clapped with both hands flat and a face so earnest that several people laughed softly and then caught themselves. Lyra winked at Callan, and his smile was the kind that finally had room to expand. In the weeks that followed, the family settled into a rhythm that felt like living inside a well-read book. Familiar chapters with the comfort of predictability, punctuated by pages that surprised. Lyra's council responsibilities grew. She started negotiating with a representative from the library for more after-school programs and met another teenager who wanted to start a makerspace. Aurelia's coursework crept forward in steady, then uneven progress. Late-night study sessions gave way to the triumph of a passed exam, and then a stretch of doubt when a practical assignment didn't go as planned. Callan took on odd jobs, fixing a neighbor's porch, repairing a fence, for the money and for the way such work kept his hands honest and his mind from wandering too far into memory. They held small rituals that seemed to hold the house upright. Saturday pancakes with syrup poured just so, a board game on rainy afternoons, the ritual of tucking Rowan in with the same patched blanket. Neighbors dropped off bread crusts or an extra carton of milk. Vivian stopped by some evenings to sit and split wood or peel potatoes and would leave without a fuss, a presence as unshowy and reliable as a kettle clicking on the stove. One afternoon, as early summer leaned in, a letter arrived for Callan. The envelope was thick, the handwriting formal but not unfriendly. He took it to the porch and sat with it on his knee, the sun making a patch of warmth on his shin. Aurelia, arriving from class, saw the paper and sat beside him without asking. Callan slid it open with a butter knife, as if opening it might be delicate work. The letter was from a regional program that offered support to families who had stepped forward to foster or adopt. They had read about guardianship arrangements and wanted to offer resources, counseling, help with schooling expenses, occasional respite care. It was not a panacea. It did not erase the weight of bills or the nights when sleep was a series of short, thin stitches. But it was an acknowledgement from beyond their street that their small labor was seen. They discussed the offer like people examining a map. There was gratitude, obviously, Aurelia's voice bright with the edges of plans, but there was also a cautiousness, the kind bred from previous disappointments. Callan read the letter aloud, and where the paper suggested options, the three of them filled in details with their own names and small practical hopes. Lyra suggested they apply for a grant to build a weatherproof shed for the garden tools, something that would both ease work and be a teaching space. Aurelia thought of a laptop that could help with research and papers. Callan, whose first thought always wandered to roofs and nails, imagined a sturdier framework for the back porch so that winter would be less worrying. That evening, after Rowan had been coaxed into pajamas and the house exhaled into an easy hush, Callan climbed to the top of the wardrobe and retrieved the box of letters he had kept. He sat on the floor of the bedroom with the lid balanced on his knees and read again the familiar lines. The folded card from Vivian with its quiet instruction to keep the light, a note from Miss Louise about a pie recipe, a thank you from a neighbor whose child's fever had been seen to. Among them, he found one envelope he had not opened in years, a letter from the mother of the children before the guardianship, a note written with the tremble of someone who had had to let go. He had kept it because he once thought he might need to know her words to explain the shape of things to Lyra and Aurelia. Now he read it slowly, not for answers. There were none that could be given, but because the act of reading felt like another small tending. The letter was a messy human thing. Apologies, fragments of explanation, a request that they keep the children safe, and a hope for the future that was brief and almost boyish. It ended with a plea for kindness. If you can, teach them to make room. Callan closed the envelope and put it back into the box. He did not show it to the children. Instead, he carried the quiet of those words with him into the next day and the next plan. Teaching them to make room, he thought, that might be the truest work he had. Summer ripened. The garden produced cucumbers that tasted like water held in green skin, beans that snapped with a clean sound, and tomatoes that bled sweetness when warmed by sun. Rowan learned to say a handful of words, Mama, Dada, more, and the sound of them rearranged the family in small, satisfying ways. One late July evening, he climbed onto Callan's knee and, with a solemn push, said the name that had once been an impossible thing to receive. Callan. Callan felt as if someone had pressed a warm hand against his chest and found the place where fear had lived and smoothed it into something else. He laughed until his ribs ached and then held Rowan as if he might not let go. They entertained the idea, quietly, of a small trip to the river. No plan, just a day with sandwiches and a blanket and the kind of idleness that felt like medicine. Lyra proposed they take a picture by the willow tree for the town newsletter, just to show that a household could look like a household, messy, content, under repair. Aurelia said yes with a little more earnestness than necessary, because the camera would make a memory not bound to the fragile architecture of recall. And yet, life did what life does. It offered the next small knot to untangle. The owner of the vacant lot at the edge of town, where children had played and the town's summer fair stored crates of hay, announced plans that would change the air. He spoke of development and profit in measured words that had the sound of inevitability. Some people in town were indifferent, others saw the lot as a hinge of community life. Lyra's council convened a meeting at the library to discuss options. It was a tidy conflict, less a crisis than a choice about what the town valued. Still, it made people gather in ways that pulled open their pockets of memory and affection. Callan listened as neighbors argued and proposed, as details of zoning and parking and traffic wound through the air like the threads of a tapestry. Lyra stood up to speak at the meeting because she felt the tug. She had spent afternoons on that lot with children playing knights and queens, and she could not imagine it turned into a row of identical townhouses. She had a way of speaking that made the room lean in. She listed the reasons: access to open space, the history of town fairs, and then, unexpectedly, she told a short story about a child who had learned to read because someone had read to them under that very tree. The story held the room because it was small enough to be true and because it was about someone they all could imagine being. In the end, the owner agreed to consider a compromise. The town would present a plan that preserved some portion of the lot for public use while allowing modest development on the remainder. It was the sort of municipal victory that required patience and a large appetite for negotiation. No one left the library that night feeling as if the future had been sealed. But the conversation had happened, and that was often the first step toward shaping what would come next. Under the willow, in the soft hours between day and dusk, Callan found himself thinking of the shape memory made in people. He had been a man who measured his life by the amount of wood stacked and the days counted out like logs in a pile. Now his measures were different. He measured by the small mouths he fed each morning, by the smudges on a child's shirt that told him where his work had been done, by the light left on at the end of the day. He thought of the letters, the garden, the benefit, the meeting about the lot, and how each of those things, the giving of soup, the building of a sign, the reading of a story, created an architecture of belonging, one that did not require grand gestures, but rather the frequent, faithful placing of one brick on another. There were no sweeping pronouncements. There was, in the end, a slow accumulation of moments. A neighbor stopping by with spare nails, a teacher staying late to help Aurelia, a child taking an extra cookie to an elderly man on his porch. Each small action bent the world a degree. Callan began to imagine a future not as a far-off thing, but as a series of rooms they might build together, each one warm in its own way. On a clear morning, when the air held the precise coolness that comes before the heat of August, Lyra led a group of children through the town to the former fairground. They set up chairs and a blanket and read aloud under the willow's long shade, their voices traveling like motes of dust in the sun. Callan watched from a distance and felt the steady, unshakable gratitude that had become a kind of marrow. He realized, as the children leaned in toward Lyra's voice, that making room, the task the letter had asked them to do, was not a single act, but a habit. It was a practice of moving aside for someone else's need, of offering a chair, an hour, or a hand. There were no sweeping pronouncements. There was, in the end, a slow accumulation of moments. A neighbor stopping by with spare nails, a teacher staying late to help Aurelia, a child taking an extra cookie to an elderly man on his porch. Each small action bent the world a degree. Callan began to imagine a future not as a far-off thing, but as a series of rooms they might build together, each one warm in its own way. On a clear morning, when the air held the precise coolness that comes before the heat of August, Lyra led a group of children through the town to the former fairground. They set up chairs and a blanket and read aloud under the willow's long shade, their voices traveling like motes of dust in the sun. Callan watched from a distance and felt the steady, unshakable gratitude that had become a kind of marrow. He realized, as the children leaned in toward Lyra's voice, that making room, the task the letter had asked them to do, was not a single act, but a habit. It was a practice of moving aside for someone else's need, of offering a chair, an hour, or a hand. And in the offering, something returned to him, the ease of belonging, the quiet note that said this was where you were meant to be. He walked toward them then, not because there was anything to repair, but because he wanted to be present to the ordinary miracle that made a town livable. Rowan toddled ahead, calling something that sounded remarkably like Papa, and Callan answered with a smile that was the shape of the life he had built, imperfect, steady, and luminous in a way that did not announce itself so much as arrive. The willow leaves whispered above them. The town went on making itself into something gentle and determined, one small kindness at a time. Callan sat on the grass with Rowan in his lap, and for a while they did nothing but listen to the sound of pages turning and children laughing, the little indispensable music of a life being stitched together. They read until the sun thinned and the sky turned the exact pale of late summer. Parents drifted back to porches. A few stayed to knot a loose rope on a swing, to sweep crumbs into a palm. Aurelia, cheeks freckled from the day, showed Callan a page she could now sound out by herself, and Lyra watched them both with a quiet, pleased steadiness. The preserved patch of green took on a life of its own. A bench here, a low shelf of books there, a small plaque nailed to the willow that named the child who had learned to read beneath it. The town's compromises were modest, their victories slow, but they were real things. Benches that bore names, hands that returned favors, a supper that fed more than hunger. Callan held Rowan as dusk gathered, and felt, without needing to say it, that belonging was built this way, not by grand plans, but by the steady practice of making room. He looked up at the willow. Its leaves shivered as if in agreement. He let the sound of the children and the turning pages settle into him, a soft ledger against the restless part of his heart. Here, he thought, was enough.